September 27th, 1830. A creek in central Mississippi. No name on any map in Washington. 6,000 witnesses camped along its banks. One sheet of paper on a folding table. By sunset, America was larger than it had been that morning, not by war, not by purchase, but by a single signature, pressed onto a treaty most Americans have never heard of, in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. The man holding the pen was 29 years old. Within a year, half his own people would call him a savior. The other half would call him something closer to a traitor. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why both sides had a case and what happened to him because of it. 7 years before Trail of Tears became a phrase every American schoolchild learns, attached to the Cherokee in 1838, the Choctaw Nation walked that same road first, in the same winter cold. Watched almost by accident by a young Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville, who never forgot what he saw on a riverbank that December. And here's the detail almost nobody knows. The phrase Trail of Tears itself may not even belong to the Cherokee story at all. It may have been spoken first, years earlier, by a Choctaw chief, to a newspaper reporter in Arkansas. This is the story of the treaty that started it. A stone marker still sits where it happened. A federal courtroom is still arguing over what it meant. And somewhere in an archive in Washington, the actual document, 18 articles, a dozen signatures, one clause almost nobody in 1830 fully understood, is still sitting exactly where they filed it. We're going to open that box. If forgotten corners of American history are the kind of thing you go looking for, the stories that never made it into the textbook chapter, only the footnote, this is exactly the kind of channel worth sticking around for. Subscribe, and let's keep digging. Start with the question almost nobody asks. Of every native nation in the American South, why was it the Choctaw who went first? Not the Creek, not the Seminole, not the Cherokee, whose removal would later become the famous one, the one that took the name Trail of Tears for the whole era. The answer is sitting in a folder most people never open, the Choctaw Nation's own diplomatic record with the United States, and it tells a strange story. In the War of 1812, Choctaw warriors fought beside Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Afterward, their chief, a man named Pushmataha, was received in Washington like visiting royalty, dinners with presidents, a seat at negotiating tables usually reserved for European ministers. Pushmataha had been negotiating with the United States for a quarter of a century by the time he died. He'd signed the Treaty of Mount Dexter in 1805, a smaller cession of hunted-out grounds the Choctaw considered a minor loss. He'd signed again in 1816. Each time he came back to the table because he believed accommodation on his own terms protected more of his nation than open resistance would. In January 1825, on that same final trip to Washington, Choctaw leadership signed one more agreement, the Treaty of Washington City, ceding still more territory. But that same document also secured something the Choctaw Nation had specifically asked for, a perpetual federal education fund, $6,000 a year, indefinitely. Within months, that money helped establish the Choctaw Academy in Kentucky, the first federally funded boarding school built for Native American students in the country's history, eventually educating boys from more than a dozen different nations. The government official who helped introduce the Choctaw to the idea of using that fund for a school was the local Indian agent handling their affairs at the time. His name was William Ward. Remember that name. He surfaces again later in the story in a very different role, doing considerably more damage. 10 years before Dancing Rabbit Creek, at a Mississippi tavern called Doak's Stand, Pushmataha had already shown Washington exactly what kind of negotiator it was dealing with. Jackson arrived, offering Choctaw land in Mississippi in exchange for territory across the river in what's now Arkansas, describing it as rich, fertile country. Pushmataha, who had actually traveled that land, wasn't buying it. He told Jackson point blank that he knew the country well, that the grass grew short, that game was scarce. Jackson's response, recorded by those present, dropped the diplomatic language entirely. He warned that much of the nation was already relocating west, whether the chiefs agreed or not, and that refusal would mean the nation's destruction. The treaty was signed 6 days later. Pushmataha had held the line as long as any Choctaw leader ever would. He died in the capital in December 1824, mid-negotiation, still fighting for his nation's land. He'd traveled to Washington specifically to petition against further cessions and to meet directly with the sitting president. Instead, he fell ill within days of arriving. The U.S. military buried him with full honors at the Congressional Cemetery. A procession 2,000 strong, President Jackson himself walking behind the coffin. He remains the only native leader of his era to receive that recognition. Notice what that means. A chief, buried by the American military with full honors. 6 years before that same government forced his entire nation off its land, his death left a gap in leadership at exactly the wrong moment. Into it stepped a very different kind of man. Greenwood LaFleury, French father, Choctaw mother, raised partly among Mississippi's planter elite, fluent in exactly the language Washington understood. By 1830, at 29, he led the Western Choctaw District, and he had reached a conclusion the older generation hadn't, that resistance on its own no longer worked. Here's the piece almost nobody connects to this story. In 1828, Georgia had begun stripping the Cherokee Nation of legal standing simply by declaring state law now applied to their territory, federal treaty or not. In 1829, gold turned up on Cherokee land, and the pressure to remove Eastern nations turned from rhetoric into something closer to inevitability. In May 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the government to trade tribal land in the East for territory beyond the Mississippi. It passed the House by exactly 5 votes. Jackson signed it within days. Then he needed proof it would actually work, fast, and on a nation large enough to matter. He picked the Choctaw. His own Secretary of War, John Eaton, was sent south, not a soldier, a cabinet officer, paired with a Tennessee colonel named John Coffee, who'd fought beside Jackson at New Orleans, and knew him well enough to be trusted with something this delicate. Jackson had wanted to handle it personally, face to face, and had summoned Choctaw leadership to meet him that August in Franklin, Tennessee. Greenwood LaFleury sent word back. The chiefs would not come. They understood exactly what a meeting like that would be used for later. A signed record of consent that hadn't actually happened yet. So Eaton and Coffee went south instead. They arrived at a spring-fed clearing in Noxubee County in mid-September 1830. The Choctaw called the creek beside it Bokchukviahila, the place the rabbit dances. Americans would flatten that into Dancing Rabbit Creek. Picture what they rode into. Morning fog still sitting low over the creek bottom. Cookfires already burning in 3 distinct clusters on the high ground above the water, each one marking a separate district's encampment, arranged in strict order of rank. Greenwood LaFleury's western district on the highest ground, Mushulatubbie's people below them, Nitakechi's district below, that and a 4th, smaller camp arriving last, a group of Christian Indians led by a chief called Hopai Iskitini, or Little Leader, nearly 6,000 people, in an encampment the size of a small town, built out of nothing in a matter of days. Horses tethered in long lines, wet leather and wood smoke in the air, children running between the tents while the adults did the harder work of pretending this was any ordinary council. None of them yet knew they were about to witness the largest single land cession any native nation would ever sign in one sitting. Some of them clearly suspected it anyway. Open the file on what happened next, and the first thing you notice is how well documented it is, better than almost any other removal-era treaty. Missionary letters, sent home in the middle of the negotiations, government dispatches, and decades later, oral histories collected directly from people who'd stood at that creek, or known the people who had, gathered by a historian named Henry Halbert, who spent years tracking down the last living witnesses before their memories were gone for good. The record opens with a small, telling detail most retellings skip entirely. The American commissioners banned missionaries and religious services from the grounds during negotiations, worried that Christian teachers among the Choctaw might sway the outcome against them. Alcohol and gambling, on the other hand, were left completely alone. Read that pairing again. Before a single word of the treaty had been discussed, the ground rules for the negotiation had already been set, and they weren't set to protect the Choctaw's judgment. 3 days after the camps went up, on September 18th, Eaton finally opened formal talks. Through him stood an interpreter named John Pitchlin, a man who had lived among the Choctaw for decades, married into the nation, and would now spend the next 2 weeks translating, sentence by sentence, a proposal designed to end his adopted people's presence east of the Mississippi River. Every word of what came next passed through him first. Eaton didn't ease into it. He opened by invoking the previous treaty, Doak's Stand, signed a decade earlier, and made it plain this council would not end without a new one. For days afterward, almost nothing moved. Here's the detail almost no version of this story includes, and it changes how the rest of the negotiation has to be read. Sitting front and center at the council by custom and by right was a group of 7 Choctaw women elders. Choctaw society was matrilineal, land and family lineage passed through women, and by tradition, no sale of ancestral land could go forward without their consent. Twice, according to the record, the terms Eaton and Coffee proposed were rejected outright because those 7 women refused to permit the sale. Furious, the commissioners did something the public council never saw happen. They called off the open negotiation entirely and met privately, just Eaton, Coffee, and a small circle of male chiefs, LaFleur among them, working out a version of the treaty away from the women who had already blocked it twice. One of the provisions that emerged from that private meeting was Article 14. The clause allowing individual families to stay and claim land of their own. It reads on the surface like a concession. Look at where it came from, and it reads differently. A workaround built specifically to route around the one form of Choctaw authority the commissioners hadn't been able to out-negotiate in the open. Hold on to that detail. It matters again in about 10 minutes. For now, back to the council floor, where the older chiefs, Mushalatabi and Nitakei, had lived through this exact pattern before, more than once. Land ceded in 1801. Again in 1805 at Mount Dexter. Again in 1816. Again at Doak Stand in 1820 5 million acres traded that time for land across the Mississippi that most Choctaw in the room had never laid eyes on. Every one of those treaties had been presented, at the time, as the final concession. None of them had been. According to missionary letters written from the grounds, Eaton's patience began running out within the first week. His message shifted from proposal to something closer to inevitability. Sign now on federal terms, or Mississippi would simply extend state law over Choctaw territory, the exact tactic already used against the Cherokee, erasing tribal courts and tribal law without a single soldier ever needing to march. It wasn't phrased as a threat. It functioned as one anyway. Multiple accounts describe entire family groups walking off the grounds overnight, disappearing back into the tree line, only to be told back the following morning by relatives or by their own chiefs. Mushulatobi and Nitakei reportedly left the council table more than once, unwilling to be remembered as the men who signed away the homeland. This is where the human cost of the negotiation stops being abstract. It wasn't only chiefs at that creek making an impossible calculation. It was 7 women who understood exactly what was being asked of them and said no twice before being negotiated around entirely. It was Pitchlynn himself, standing between both sides for 12 straight days, responsible for making sure neither side missed the meaning of what the other had just said. LaFleur stayed at the table through all of it. His argument, recorded by those who heard it, wasn't that removal was good. It was that the choice in front of the Choctaw Nation was no longer between keeping the land and losing it. Mississippi's legal maneuvering had already made that outcome close to certain. The only real choice left in his telling was negotiating terms now, or having far worse terms imposed later with no negotiation at all. By September 25th, after 10 days, a framework existed. 2 more days of revision followed, article by article, argued out in a language most of the men signing it had learned only recently, if at all. On September 27th, the signatures went down. Here's a genuine question for the comments. Were you taught the Trail of Tears started with the Cherokee in 1838? Most people were, and most people have never heard the Choctaw walked it first, 7 years earlier, in the same winter cold. If you're watching from Mississippi or Oklahoma, we'd love to know whether Dancing Rabbit Creek was ever part of the history you grew up with, and whether you've ever stood at that creek yourself. The headline of the treaty fits on a plaque. The Choctaw Nation ceded its entire homeland east of the Mississippi, surveyed afterward at just over 4 million acres, contemporary tallies of the time rounding higher, toward 11 or 12 million once unsurveyed portions were counted, in exchange for roughly 15 million acres in the Indian Territory that would become southeastern Oklahoma. The plaque doesn't mention what Article 14 actually did once it left the negotiating table. Here's the part almost nobody notices. The clause promised any Choctaw head of family who wanted to stay in Mississippi the right to register, claim up to 640 acres, and become a United States citizen, making the Choctaw, on paper, the first major non-European ethnic group in American history to gain that recognition. To register that claim, families had to go through one man, a federal Indian agent named William Ward. Notice the name. This is the same William Ward who 5 years earlier had helped the Choctaws set up the education fund that built their academy in Kentucky. A man with a documented history of standing between the Choctaw Nation and the federal government, in what had once looked like a constructive role. Whatever goodwill that history brought him didn't survive what came next. Pull his name and the very different document surfaces. A congressional investigation opened in 1842, barely a decade after the treaty was signed, into exactly how Ward had handled those registrations. What it found, Ward refused to register nearly all of the hundreds of Choctaw people who came to him. Some accounts describe him going into hiding to avoid claimants altogether. Others describe him threatening applicants with physical violence simply for showing up to file the paperwork the treaty had promised them. Read that again. The government's own investigation. Its own agent, refusing, hiding from, and threatening the very people a federal treaty had guaranteed the right to register. While Ward was turning families away, land-hungry settlers were already moving in, buying up Choctaw improved land, straight from underneath the people still living on it, in a rush historians describe as overwhelming the remaining Choctaw population numerically within a few short years. The congressional investigation into Ward's conduct wasn't fully resolved for more than 60 years. Out of it eventually came a system of Choctaw scrip, a kind of substitute paper claim issued decades later in the 1840s and 1850s to families whose land had already been given away and could no longer be returned. The government's own tally, when it finally added things up, 1,150 heads of families and 2,683 of their children found eligible for compensation for land that Article 14 had promised them outright, and that Ward's registry had made sure most of them never received. Most of their individual names didn't survive in any record built to be remembered. What survived is the number. 1,150 families, 2,683 children. A generation's worth of promised land reduced to a line item in a scrip register a quarter century later. Of the roughly 19 to 25,000 Choctaw people the treaty applied to, historians estimate only 5,000 to 6,000 ultimately stayed in Mississippi, some through claims that survived Ward's registry against the odds, many more simply by evading the whole process and disappearing into the backcountry rather than risk it. They became the ancestral base of what is today the federally recognized Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, still living within 100 miles of that creek 2 centuries later. The rest, the majority, some 14 to 20,000 people, began preparing to leave everything. Pull the removal file itself, and it turns out to be even more carefully planned and even more quickly botched than most retellings suggest. The government assigned a supervisor named George Gaines to manage the whole operation, and Gaines made a decision that shaped everything after it. Rather than move the entire Choctaw Nation at once, he would remove roughly 1/3 of the population each year across 3 separate waves, 1831, 1832, and 1833. The first wave, scheduled for that November, called for Choctaw families from the northern and western districts to gather at Memphis, Tennessee, while families from the southern district gathered downriver at Vicksburg, Mississippi. From there, steamboats were supposed to carry them onward. And the boat names themselves survive in the shipping records: the Walter Scott, the Brandywine, the Reindeer, the Talma, the Cleopatra. What the shipping records don't fully capture is what happened once the boats reached their limit and the walking began. That winter turned out to be one of the harshest on record. Rivers clogged with ice for weeks at a stretch. A group traveling out of Vicksburg was led by a guide who lost his way entirely and wandered for days into the Lake Providence swamps before the route could be corrected. Rations for the journey, according to surviving accounts, sometimes came down to a handful of boiled corn, a single turnip, and 2 cups of heated water per person per day. The cost of that first removal ran more than twice what the government had budgeted. Gaines was removed from his post. The army took over the second and third waves entirely. It was during that first chaotic wave, in Memphis, in the winter of 1831, that Alexis de Tocqueville happened to be passing through. He watched a group of Choctaw families waiting to cross the frozen river, in conditions with no organized transport waiting on the other side, no soldiers directing the crossing, nothing but people carrying what they could. He wrote of a controlled, almost eerie quiet among them. Not the sound of grief, but something that unsettled him more. And here is the detail that appends almost everything most people think they know about this era. When the group finally reached Little Rock, Arkansas, a Choctaw chief, the record isn't entirely certain whether it was Nitikeki himself or a leader named Thomas Harkins, gave a short statement to a local paper, the Arkansas Gazette. Describing the journey behind them, he called it, in the reporter's own transcription, a trail of tears and death. Notice the year, 1831, 7 years before the Cherokee March that the whole country now associates with that exact phrase. The words may have belonged to the Choctaw first, spoken to a small frontier newspaper that almost nobody outside Arkansas ever read, describing a removal that history would go on to half forget. De Tocqueville and an anonymous chief at Little Rock weren't the only ones putting what was happening into words. Once the treaty took effect, the Choctaw people largely rejected the leadership that had signed it. Leflory and Mushalatubby were both effectively pushed aside, and a 21-year-old named George W. Harkins, nephew to Mushalatubby, was elected to lead the Northwestern District in their place. Harkins boarded a steamboat called the Huron in February 1832 as part of the second removal wave and wrote a letter from aboard that ship addressed simply to the American people. It was reprinted in newspapers across the country, including the widely read Niles Register out of Baltimore. A man barely out of his teens, writing in what wasn't even his first language, laid out with striking composure exactly why his nation was leaving, pinned, in his own words, between 2 evils, and choosing the one that let them stay free. Across all 3 waves, from 1831 to 1833, something like 15,000 Choctaw people made the journey west. Historians estimate the deaths at somewhere between roughly a quarter and a third of that number, a range that different scholars place between around 3,700 and 5,000 people, while other demographic estimates put the overall population loss closer to 15%. The range itself is honest. Record-keeping at the time was too incomplete to know the number more precisely, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What isn't in dispute is the template this set. A treaty negotiated in public, then rerouted in private once the one form of Choctaw authority that couldn't be talked out of a no said no twice. A protective clause that quietly failed almost everyone who relied on it, at the hands of the one government agent standing between a family and their own promised land. Removal that was underfunded, poorly planned, and timed for the worst possible season, 3 years running. Every one of those elements would repeat with only minor variation. In the treaties forced on the Creek in 1832, the Chickasaw in 1834, and finally the Cherokee in 1838, whose removal absorbed the name Trail of Tears into public memory, while the Choctaw crossing that came first, and that may have given the phrase its very words, faded quietly into a footnote. There's a specific, almost accidental reason for that erasure. The Cherokee case reached the Supreme Court first. Worcester versus Georgia, decided in 1832, a ruling in the Cherokee Nation's favor that the Jackson administration simply ignored outright, an act of open defiance against the nation's highest court that later writers found irresistible to retell. The Choctaw removal had already been legally finalized through a signed treaty 2 full years earlier, with far less courtroom drama attached to it, which meant, over time, it offered a thinner story to keep retelling, even though the human consequences, and quite possibly the very language used to describe them, remained closely connected. Dancing Rabbit Creek wasn't the most widely remembered episode of Indian removal. It was simply the first. Pull one more document from the file, a cotton export ledger from the 1830s, and the transformation set in motion by the treaty becomes tangible. The land opened by the Dancing Rabbit Creek cession sat inside what would later be called Mississippi's Black Belt, some of the richest cotton soil in North America. Within a decade of the signing, Mississippi's population and cotton output were expanding at a rate historians still describe as one of the fastest state transformations in antebellum America. Land patents issued once the ceded territory was surveyed show the same pattern repeating county by county across the former Choctaw homeland. Land offices auctioning parcels within a few short years, often to speculators purchasing in bulk rather than families acquiring a single farm. Newspapers of the era carried auction notices for tracts inside the former Choctaw cession, much like modern papers carry real estate listings. Land that a decade earlier had been under tribal law now changing hands again through public sales, beyond the view of many who had once lived there. That expansion unfolded alongside the growth of slavery. This cession, together with similar land acquired from the Creek and Chickasaw during the same period, became part of what historians describe as the domestic slave trade's second great wave, with hundreds of thousands of enslaved people relocated from the tobacco regions of Virginia and the Carolinas to the expanding cotton frontier over the following 2 decades. The same fields where Choctaw children had once gathered near cook fires at Dancing Rabbit Creek were, within a few short years, surveyed into cotton fields worked by enslaved laborers brought from communities more than 1,000 miles away. By the eve of the Civil War, Mississippi was the nation's leading cotton-producing state, its economy and political identity rooted in land that, 3 decades earlier, the United States had guaranteed to the Choctaw Nation under the Treaty of Doak Stand before renegotiating that agreement a decade later at Dancing Rabbit Creek. And here the story circles back to the man who signed that treaty into existence. Pull the file on Greenwood LaFleur's life after 1830, and the ending isn't the one most versions of this story choose to emphasize. He was deposed as principal chief almost immediately by the very council that had watched him negotiate the cession, accused of agreeing to terms that many believed benefited him more than the nation. He later faced serious threats to his safety and remained in Mississippi, accepting the United States citizenship offered under Article 14. What he built next is the detail that changes how you have to read everything that came before it. LaFleur became one of the wealthiest cotton planters in the state. His estate at Malmaison eventually running to some 15,000 acres, worked by roughly 400 enslaved people, built almost entirely on land carved out of the same cotton frontier his own treaty had helped open. The man who signed away 11 million acres of Choctaw homeland spent the rest of his life as a planter inside the economy that homeland's loss had created, serving 2 terms in the Mississippi legislature, a personal friend of men who would go on to lead the Confederacy. Then, when Mississippi actually seceded in 1861, LaFleur, slaveholder, planter, former chief sided with the Union. He died in 1865 at the end of the war and was buried at his own request wrapped in an American flag. His own people didn't let that stand. According to the family's own account, passed down and still told today, Choctaw descendants who never forgave him for Dancing Rabbit Creek later dug up his body and reburied it, face down, in a location that was deliberately never recorded. Half his own people called him a savior, the other half called him a traitor. Even in death, that argument never resolved. The story doesn't stop at the Civil War either. But it isn't only a story of loss on the far side of that river either. Pull the file on what the Choctaw built once they arrived in the Indian Territory, and it reads less like an ending than a second founding. The Choctaw Academy's own students and teachers, once funding for the Kentucky school dried up in the 1840s, relocated west and helped establish new institutions on Choctaw ground. Spencer Academy in 1844, Armstrong Academy the same year, schools built and run by the Choctaw Nation itself, on Taptora, Choctaw terms for the first time. Armstrong Academy's site, gathered around a natural spring strong enough to power a gristmill, eventually grew into Chattahamaha, Choctaw Town, which served as the nation's own capital for 2 decades, from 1863 to 1883. The 15 million acres the Choctaw received in exchange became the foundation of the Choctaw Nation as it exists today in southeastern Oklahoma, and the exact boundaries drawn by this same 1830 treaty resurfaced as live legal questions far more recently than most people would expect. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled in McGirt v. Oklahoma that a large stretch of eastern Oklahoma, including much of the city of Tulsa, remained legally reservation land under treaties Congress had never formally disestablished. That ruling rests on the same category of 19th century treaty as the one signed at Dancing Rabbit Creek. In the years since, reservation boundary cases tied directly to the Choctaw Nation's own 1830 treaty lands have been argued in federal court as well, testing exactly how much legal weight a 200-year-old signature still carries in an American courtroom today. The paper signed under an oak canopy in September 1830 didn't just end with the land changing hands. It's still quite literally being argued over. Dancing Rabbit Creek still runs through Noxubee County, Mississippi, largely unchanged from the descriptions left by the people who stood there in 1830. In 1996, the site became a National Historic Landmark, marked today by a modest stone memorial and a small Choctaw cemetery, a quiet clearing for a place where the largest single native land cession in American history was signed in a single afternoon. There's no marker for Pushmataha's decades of resistance. Nothing explaining what 7 women elders tried to stop, twice, before it was negotiated around them. Nothing about William Ward, the agent whose name barely survives outside a congressional file, but whose refusals quietly shaped which Choctaw families got to stay and which didn't. No plaque telling the 1,150 families and their 2,683 children who were, decades later, finally acknowledged as having been owed land they never received. And certainly nothing marking an unrecorded plot of ground somewhere in Carroll County, Mississippi, where the man who signed the treaty was buried a second time, face down by the people he believed he had saved. What the treaty actually changed can't be measured in acreage alone. It changed who owned some of the richest farmland in North America and what that ownership would be used for. It reshaped an entire state's economy and, by extension, the path of American slavery's westward expansion in the decades leading to Civil War. It set a template, public negotiation, private workaround, a failed protective clause, underfunded winter removal, followed with only minor adjustment in every major removal treaty that came after, right up through the Cherokee March that took the name for the whole era, while the crossing that came first, and that may have coined the very words used to describe it, quietly receded from memory. And it left behind 2 Choctaw nations that still exist today on opposite ends of the story it created. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, descended from those who found a way to stay, still living within 100 miles of that creek, and the much larger Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, built on the 15 million acres received in exchange, whose reservation boundaries are, right now, still being tested in federal court 2 centuries later. If you ever stand at that quiet creek in Noxubee County, no crowd, no 6,000 people camped along its banks, no Secretary of War waiting with a treaty and an unspoken threat. It's worth remembering what that stillness is covering. 12 days of negotiation. 7 women who said no, twice, before being negotiated around. An interpreter carrying the weight of every sentence exchanged. A clause meant as protection that became a trap for thousands at the hands of one man whose name almost nobody remembers. A phrase born on a riverbank in Arkansas that history quietly handed to a different removal 7 years later. And one afternoon in September, when the American map was redrawn permanently, in a place most Americans will never have reason to visit. The oak grove is still there, the creek still runs, and the treaty signed beside it is still, in the most literal legal sense, unfinished business. There's a reason the loudest tragedies in American history aren't always the first ones. And Dancing Rabbit Creek is proof that some of the most consequential days in this country's story happened quietly enough to nearly slip out of memory altogether. If that's the kind of history you want more of, there's another forgotten American story waiting in the next Black Oak documentary. And it starts, like this one did, with a place nobody thought to remember.